Rationality, that which was at the heart of much of Enlightenment and modernity's promises, particularly in science, is at the core of our discussion today. I'm thrilled to be joined by Nada Raza, Assistant Curator for South Asia at Tate Modern in London. She was the guest curator for the Abraj Group Art Prize in 2014 and has worked with Neva, Green Cardamom, and projects in the UAE and Pakistan. Her curatorial project for the Dhaka Art Summit, The Missing One, flirts with the convergence of futurism, sci-fi, dystopia, and enchantment via works of art made between 1922 and the present. And it is some of her research for this exhibition that I'm hoping to parse through to think about in relation to nuances of history, time, and the future. I'd like to look at art and literature in some sense to think about politics embedded in those forms. This is in part a topic that is very near and dear to my heart, and in some sense, in March, you will be talking about the curatorial project. And this conversation will serve as a meta-discursive take on that exhibition, at least in my sense, I think. If you're curious about the exhibition, you should go to Dhaka. It opens February 6th to the 9th, is that correct?
From the 5th, actually.
From the 5th?
Sorry,
from the
can
5th.
you hear me?
If you can't make it to Dhaka, definitely join us in Dubai, where she will be presenting her work again in March. In thinking about this exhibition and the title and the group of artists that you are bringing together, you mentioned very specifically it's from 1922 to the present. And I think it's interesting to think of that generation of artists as the first generation who grew up with science fiction and rationalism, in some sense embedded in their social and intellectual fabric. So someone like Isaac Asimov, who also grew up in that generation, a hard science fiction writer, also a biochemistry professor at Boston University, and who later in his fiction first coined the word robotics, is known for saying things like, and I quote, "True science fiction could not really exist until people understood the rationalism of science and began to use it with respect to their stories," end quote. So in some sense, science fiction could only exist as a genre once science and technology had become normalized. Once it was rational to think that science could control climate, progress, work, then we could imagine what was beyond that, what might fall into the category of the irrational, fantastical, or fictional. That desire to see what lay beyond what classified as rational and rationalism has a very particular history in South Asia. The rational was also always considered in opposition to magic, ritual, and religion. And so if we consider some of our earliest examples of science fiction from Bengal, we have stories such as Jagadnanda Roy's Shukra Brahma, or Travels to Venus, which was published in 1879, in which he describes alien life forms. And these are the alien life forms from Venus, which remarkably sound like apes. And it's kind of interesting to think about that in relationship to Darwin's work, right? Because it's coming out around the same time. We also have an 1896 piece by Jagadish Chandra Bose, who wrote Nirudreshwar Kahani, which is one of my favorites, and I know you and I have spoken about this, in which a cyclone was averted by the use of a bottle of hair oil. In each case, there's a negotiation between the rational, the religious, and the impossibly possible. These texts are followed by works which we may all know are more familiar with by H.G. Wells. Whether we think of Wells' 1898 work, The War of the Worlds, in which we encounter aliens from Mars, or one of my favorites, his 1902 Discovery of the Future, again, these emerge at the height of the first industrial revolution, with science and technology being the answer to the specter of scarcity that haunted Western society for centuries. For many, it was not just about economics, though, but rather these senses and emancipatory imaginations also had socio-political implications in the world. But somewhere in those rationalisms, imagination also allowed for a certain enchantment to maintain itself. And this is where I'm going to turn to you, Nada. How can we think of this generation of artists who have come of age in a time when hair oil bottles can avert cyclones and aliens from Mars and Venus have already taken shape? In your mind, how do these notions of science, rationalism, and enchantment relate? And perhaps you might even use this as a way to introduce how you thought through this exhibition, what you thought about. And we might even pull up the image of Tagore here, Tagore's piece that we will talk about.
Thank you, Uzma, and thank you, Global Art Forum, for inviting me to come and talk about my next 4-day exhibition. I jumped at the opportunity because I have spent a lot of time conceptualizing the show. It opens in less than a month's time, and it has 23 artists in it. So what we thought we would do today is really talk about the kind of conceptual backdrop against which the show was curated. And then in March, I will actually present the show sort of after the fact. I think for me, the kind of moment, the eureka moment really happened on my first research trip to Bangladesh. So I was invited to curate an exhibition of emerging contemporary art from South Asia. That was the invitation, and of course, that's not what I'm doing. And I walked into a collector's home, and there was a wall of Bengal school Tagore paintings. And I have to say, since then, I've kind of been haunted by this Gauguenendranath Tagore image. And Gauguenendranath of the kind of Tagore family. So just to give a bit of backdrop, the Tagore family was central to the Bengal Renaissance. This is kind of the turn of the 20th century. And Calcutta was one of the, I guess, the intellectual centers of colonial India at that time. And so there's a rich, really lively culture of printing and writing in English. There is a huge engagement with the world. So Rabindranath Tagore is at this point corresponding with Ezra Pound and with Einstein, and is kind of traveling the world and is really becoming this sort of global figure. Gauguenendranath is from the family. He's his nephew. He had a relatively short life, but within that he produced these kind of almost luminous watercolors. And this work, we don't have an exact date. The date, circa 1922, is dated through the fact that there was a Bauhaus exhibition in Calcutta around that time, and Tagore would have produced this body of work for that show. What's interesting about this piece in particular is its title, Resurrection, and the fact that it's inscribed on the back with a biblical quote. So formally, it looks like a kind of futurist painting. And I've kind of imagined all the different ways in which he might have encountered either Marinetti and Futurismo, or even Wyndham Lewis and the British futurists. It's likely that he was looking at publications that were traveling there from London at the time. In the center is a crucifix, this sort of celestial chapel, and the figure of a saint, perhaps Christ. And the quote on the back is, "I will be with you always, even until the end of time." So, of course, my hair stood up on end. And I realized that here was an actual visual kind of attempt to think about spirituality and futurism together. And so if somebody is in Bengal is thinking along these lines in 1922, why are atheist bloggers being hacked in the present, And this is the sort of the thing that's kind of interesting when you're working in Dhaka, I didn't want to ask that question. What I wanted to then do is create a narrative within which this notion of these two forces being in opposition could be challenged, right? So I then started looking at work of contemporary artists, and again I found that there were these kind of individual works that stood outside what we might curatorially, my research at Tate is really looking at South Asia in the context of the Euro-American, museological canons and about kind of transforming and annotating and changing that story. But if there's a young artist from Karachi working, or Lahore working on steampunk, those works don't necessarily enter into this conversation. They kind of fit elsewhere. And so I started kind of cataloging all these works that I had seen. My list was, I had 60 or 70 artists by the end of it. So I kind of narrowed that down into looking at a kind of very sci-fi narrative. And I'm just going to show you something that I discovered along the way, which was to me, again, this kind of epiphany. I found this on my own bookshelf. It's called Ballroom of the Skies, and I think I stole it from my dad. I think at some point I just took all the books in my house. And obviously he was a sci-fi fan. So Ballroom of the Skies is a book by John D. MacDonald from 1952. And I'm just going to read the blurb on the back. Have you ever stopped to wonder why the world is eternally war-torn? Why men of goodwill, seeking only peace, are driven relentlessly to further disaster? In Ballroom of the Skies, John D. MacDonald suggests a strange and monstrous explanation. He pictures an intricate and totally convincing future society where India rules the globe and everyone chases the mighty rupee. The first atomic war has just ended, and already the second is clearly building. People shrug. War is man's nature, they think. And that's what Drake Lauren thought until he became aware of the aliens living amongst us and discovered their sinister purpose. So, this book has this sort of, and actually in the text itself, it's Pak India, which for me was even better. And Pak India was going to save the world. So I thought, perfect.
It's so believable.
Yes.
It's so believable. So I'm just going to push you a bit more to think a bit, or to talk a bit about sort of these kinds of relationships with spiritual. I mean, like you brought up spirituality, a sort of very futurist look to them, right? And something enchanted about them. But then there's also the specter of violence, right? And so, in your mind, what is the relationship to violence and the future? Well, that doesn't seem, science fiction. The ways in which we might think about trauma, which is something I'm more interested in thinking through. I know that you're working with Mehreen Murtaza as well on the Restoring Partition project. And so I wonder if there's some way we can kind of transition this and think about trauma, science fiction. And actually, maybe we could pull up Mehreen's work as well. We have a few, it's a
Mehreen is an artist who's in the show, and this is actually not in the exhibition. I have another work that references Abdus Salam in the exhibition, who was a Nobel Prize-winning Pakistani physicist, but he is now sort of written out of the national narrative because he's from the wrong religious minority. And I wanted to, again, clock that within the context of the show. But this is something she's produced really recently, and it's come out in a sort of graphic compilation of graphic art by South Asians. And the book is called Restoring Partition, so it's artists and writers responding to the legacy of partition.
Right.
But Mehreen's work resonated, or at least this and I'm not sure if you'll be able to read it from this distance, but really, again, it's looking at partition through this kind of dystopian, very South Asian mode of storytelling. And it related quite well with sort of what Arthur MacDonald was prophesying. And it's interesting, again, to see how this theme that circulated in the 50s returns in the work of an artist working in 2015. How these ideas kind of resonate, circulate, come back to life. Right. In the context of the exhibition, what I have done is create a very tight narrative. So what you do is you move through this kind of idea of enchantment or looking up at the sky that starts with the Tagore. Right. And then you move into a section which really has to do with estrangement and alienation and the foreigner. And there you have work by, say, David Aylesworth, who's been living and working in Lahore. And in the 80s had done these, after the Pakistan-India nuclear face-off, he made these works called probes, which magically appeared in the Karachi landscape. And so that's work made in the 80s, but when you look at it now, you not only see what he was doing with pop culture, you also see this completely changed landscape, urban landscape, and how that has transformed over time, kind of relating back to the kind of images of Dubai we were looking at before. You have work by Saskia Pantalon, who's an artist. She's in her, I think, late 70s, early 80s, living in Sri Lanka in possibly the most amazing house I have ever seen. It's a Tadao Ando designed, almost like landed from way in the future.
Wow.
Pavilion on a cliff in Sri Lanka, and she's been living and working there for the last 20 years. So these kind of figures enter, and the work is, again, really about alienation and estrangement and this kind of interaction with a foreign landscape and how you move within that. And then the last section resonates more with themes around climate change and the Anthropocene and the apocalypse.
Right.
So there's a kind of heaven and hell mirroring that's going on. And so that's how the kind of spiritual and the futuristic and I guess the violence of the everyday for me really interacted. It's really happening through the conversations between those works.
Right.
I mean, it's, I guess, curatorially quite heavy-handed.
Yeah.
But
well, no.
I wanted to kind of see if you could actually almost use the artwork to tell a story that was still a fictional kind of constructed, heavily constructed story.
Yeah. There's something wonderful about imagining a sort of sense of alienation of self and being able to look up, right? To look up to the sky. And so it's, I kind of wonder if that's the space of enchantment, maybe? What do you think? Like, is there...
Or like fate, in some sense, there is a relationship between belief and fiction, which for me is really interesting. And it's something I feel like in my curatorial projects I keep returning to, this idea of the leap of the imagination or the capacity to kind of go with an obviously constructed idea. And I think there is something about fate or the irrational that resonates there, that we always kind of, you don't speak it, but this idea of what is the missing one? What is the story of the missing one? Who is this missing entity? And in sci-fi, so you spoke about Asimov. What you might find interesting is Arthur C. Clarke lived in Sri Lanka. And Sigiriya, which is a major archaeological site, in one of his books becomes a portal to another world.
Right.
So these kind of, these relationships between the deep past and the deep future have been explored within South Asia by sci-fi writers.
Right.
It's just, I wanted to turn to artists to see if the same kind of work was starting to happen. Yeah. And it's not restricted, of course, to South Asia. I mean, we know in the Middle East, and especially in the Gulf, this has been in Sophia's work, and also I've seen some things come out of Iran, which are really, kind of dealing with the tensions of the present through science fiction. Right. But in the world of literature itself, I have a friend who's an editor, and she's been editing compilations of sci-fi. And there's recently one on Africa that seems super exciting, and they've translated sci-fi stories written again in the late 1800s. So, there is a kind of, I mean, this material has always been there, it's just we've just started to re-look at it.
Yeah. I think also thinking about this relationship between a time when rationalism was really what was at stake, right, with science and with a new way of being secular, right, and to be able to then parse through and think about that as being one very important mode of and way of being. Like, for example, like we just talked about Asimov, right? So he was like a diehard rationalist, but he was also like a really hardcore science fiction writer. And in his science fiction, you had to take a leap of faith. Yep. Right? So that I find to be very interesting, and I think that's what you're kind of getting at with a lot of the inclusion of this work. So now if we shift, though, and come to your interests, so we've got that as one aspect of what you're doing, but you're clearly fascinated with the dystopic, right? So what's going on with that? How are you linking enchantment with dystopia? Because I can see some things, but I'm just curious.
So, I'll speak through the work, and obviously I'll be showing images in March, but But what was interesting to me was two things. One was a show that I saw in Bombay that was referencing the Anthropocene. I thought, you know, there was a bit of everybody's doing this right now. And then there was also, you know, particular works, either from that selection or from the things that I saw in Dhaka, that seemed to be really trying to deal with the kind of horror of the present, you know. And it's, I think it's a difficult, you know, it's a difficult way to end a show. It's kind of pessimistic, but at the same time, there is then the promise of the space for a new beginning. And so Tejal Shah's work, for instance, that I'm showing, that was shown at Documenta, I'm showing an extension of that project and some of those works. You kind of have these robotic, you know, androgynous beings that are moving through what's essentially one of the largest dumping grounds in the world. But it's beautifully choreographed. It's almost like a dance set to a kind of clicking insect-like music, and it's completely haunting. You know, it does really draw you in. There's a beauty to dystopia. There's a beauty to kind of these apocalyptic images, which again, for me, went back to that kind of really seductive beauty of the Tagore. You know,
maybe actually, could we cue up Zohaib Ghazi's work as well, the video? So this aesthetic of dystopia, right, is quite clear in Zohaib's work. Do you want to set that up for us a bit so we can? So
this is something that that I, you know, and I'm still kind of in conversation. But this, and thanks to the power of social media, anything sci-fi that happens anywhere in South Asia, people send me. And so this is a young graphic novelist, musician, and I guess writer who has just published a science fiction book. I don't have a copy yet, but it's just come out in Pakistan. And he works in a music production, so he's worked with a young singer, and he's made a music video. Apparently took him 3 years to work on this animation and created kind of a set of characters, including a female heroine. And it's based in Karachi, which is one of the more kind of sites of urban, in terms of urban violence. I grew up there in the 80s, and you know, we've had kind of periodic waves of gangland-style violence. And so this work is really coming from there. And I think for me, again, thinking through the show, I was trying to think of it, you know, in terms of what does sci-fi and futurism look like from these cities? What does it look like in Dhaka? What does it look like in Karachi? And so this is a sort of vignette of what it looks like in Karachi.
Maybe in closing, if you could talk a bit about the ways in which, well, I can't really expand too much, but a bit about these kinds of new projects that are coming out of places like Karachi, especially places that have such a deep history, well, an increasingly deep history of violence.
I think for me it becomes, you know, again, the question of, you know, we talked about robotics, and it becomes a question of what it means to be human, and dealing with the kind of almost the city as a machine and living within it. And as I said, when I made this list, I had almost 50 or 60 works. So there are kind of many other exhibitions to do with futurism and sci-fi that I hope other people will make, to do kind of with not just, you know, or not just kind of violence or dystopia, but again, as Zohaib has done, dealing with the kind of feminist reading of what it means to then have to kind of be human in that landscape, or to think about, you know, more tightly about just what the kind of possibilities that science fiction offers in terms of narrativizing the kind of divisions, the nationalist divisions, or the more political kind of violence that exists. And I think it really is about imagining a future in which that violence is maybe a part of life rather than outside of it. And I think that's what I'm kind of starting to see through those kind of more, I don't know, more realistic futurism, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you for this. Please join me in thanking Nada.